Digital transformation has been one of the big buzzwords in the last few years. This is the second part of our interview with Dr. Gerald Kane, professor at the Boston College and co-author of the book, The Transformation Myth, Leading Your Organization Through Uncertain Times. In this part, we'll talk about the different forms of disruption, as well as give more practical advice. What are the right decision-making investment strategies companies have to take in this era of digital transformation? Another thing that you talk about quite a bit is acute and chronic disruption, right? Or the difference between acute and chronic disruption. Can you elaborate a little bit on that part?
Yeah, so really that came out of this pivot in March of 2020 to change the direction of our second book, was we had a sense that book number one, which was about digital transformation, was uniquely relevant to what companies were dealing with respect to COVID, and we sought to find out why. And the answer why is it's all about disruption. It's just different paces of disruption. So a chronic disruption is much like a chronic medical condition, something that's with you for a long time. It plays out slowly and over, and you can sort of ignore it for the short term and go on as life as usual. And that was digital transformation. You know, we all knew the world was digital transformation from 2010 to 2020. We all know, or 2008, let's say, from the financial crisis to about the pandemic. It was about these slow changes that people could put off to next quarter, they could put off to next year. We all knew the changes were happening, but they weren't. They were chronic. They were not happening that fast. Then pandemic comes. That's an acute disruption. That's one you have to deal with. And it changes sort of your mindset in the world. And in some ways, the things you need to do are the same. It's just the pace at which it takes place. And of course, we're all dealing with multiple series of chronic and acute disruptions, whether it's global race relations, whether it's climate change, whether it's all these digital disruption keeps going on. But then if you look back, as part of this book, we were thinking about how unique is COVID. And if you look back over the last really 100 years, there is a globally defining crisis about every decade. If you go back to, it was COVID from here. If you go back 10 years, it was the financial crisis of 2008-ish. Back 10 years before that, dot-com boom and bust, an Asian financial crisis. Go back 10 years before that, fall of the Soviet Union. Go back 10 years before that, Cold War, hyperinflation of the late 70s. Go back 10 years before that, you're into the midst of the 60s and all of that disruption, and Vietnam. You go back 10 years before that, it's World War II. 10 years before that, it's the stock market crash. So, I mean, really, this concept that acute disruptions of global magnitudes happen about every 10 years. And why are we surprised when this one comes up? It's always different, but being able and willing and capable of responding quickly to these, I think are some of these events that define who is going to survive and who is going to thrive in the coming in the age that is defined by that disruption.
Yeah. When I read about this concept, the acute and chronic disruption that you're just mentioning, it reminded me of one thing that I can see actually quite a bit in our industry. We work with software companies, like hundreds of software companies all over the world. And the thing is that, before the pandemic, all of them are growing. All of them are growing normally, every year they were growing up. And then during the pandemic, all of these companies grew extensively, like just 2-3 times in 1 year. They just grew so fast, so massively. And why is this? Because obviously they drive innovation and disruption in a way, or they drive digital change. Because at the end of the day, obviously you work with these companies in order to create innovative products, right? So you need them for that part. This is just, little anecdote, let's say, or something that it reminded me of.
Absolutely. I mean, we saw software, particularly cloud companies. I think cloud is going to emerge as the MVP of the technology out of the pandemic. That it just enabled so many different capabilities for organizations. But not all software companies. Slack really. You would have expected Slack to follow Zoom's trajectory, and it just didn't. And what does that tell you about its viability, sort of as a long-term viability as a platform? So I think a lot of things shook out. And the other real risk, I think, for software companies is to, and this is the Peloton story, right? They assumed pandemic growth was going to happen forever, and lo and behold, things are changing back again to a certain extent. And knowing, sort of having an accurate assessment of the future and how that future is going to affect your organization. But I certainly, for the software companies that I followed, most experience between a 4 and 10 times increase in demand, which is disruption in and of itself, right? I mean, I interviewed a company called Olo, which is a restaurant platform. And they had two versions of their product, an in-restaurant one and a delivery platform. And they had to pivot overnight. Their demand shifted entirely to one dried up, one went massive, and they needed to pivot quickly to sort of rethink their product offering in the midst of the pandemic. And that was a non-trivial problem. They had to sort of like ramp up capabilities very quickly to be able to respond.
Okay, so let's get practical. Let's say I'm a small or medium-sized business and I'm not by nature an extremely, let's say, innovative kind of company, but I want to make sure that I have the right setup and that I'm going into the right direction. What would you advise? What might be the first steps such kind of a company should take?
Yeah. So first, I would like to distinguish between small and medium enterprises because I think those actually deal with these very differently. Most of our research that says the ones that really tend to thrive in disruption settings are small and large. The rationale is the large companies have resources to throw at the problem. They can just buy their way out of the crisis they find themselves in. The small ones are nimbler, so they are able to make changes more quickly. They're able to respond. The medium is sort of stuck in between, right? They're not quite as nimble as the small ones, but don't have the resources to throw at it that the big ones do. And so those are the ones that are going to probably need to be a little more intentional about making this happen. From a technical perspective, I think where you throw your money now is cloud, as far as getting more and more of your capabilities shifted over to the cloud, mainly because it allows you to buy world-class technology, world-class service at a bargain basement price, and you only pay for what you use. And to the extent to which you can migrate to the cloud and are comfortable migrating to the cloud and using this as an excuse, I think it's only going to help organizations. So finding places where it makes sense to do that. Then I think the next one is make sure you invest. This goes somewhat atypical advice. Make sure you're investing in your employees. Part of this is making sure you have the right talent in house. Do you need to go hire new talent to make this happen? In our first research, most organizations said, and this is pre-pandemic, we need more and better talent to be able to realize our digital capabilities. But the really interesting ones, those that were further ahead, said it's not that we're going out and hiring new talent on the market. We're making sure our employees have the skills and are developing the skills they need to compete in a digital world. So it's not necessarily about going and finding the talent. It's about cultivating the talent you do have. Some of that is about training, but by and large, many organizations said they didn't find that training worked all that well. The real benefit came is, are you creating jobs and working conditions that allow people to be innovative and to explore this sort of growth mindset? Some of the ways you do that is having people move around jobs, whether that's a tour of duty model where you spend 3 years in a position and then shift to another position, whether that's giving them diverse projects to work on, whether that's giving them a certain amount of slack time to work on. So for software companies, many will say, we give our employees 10% of the time to work on open source projects that aren't related to their job, because they find that those employees are still gaining skills that benefit their job, whether that's about having an innovation accelerator in your organization. It's something Goldman does. Any employee once a year can pitch an idea for an innovation, and it's vetted by senior management, and they pick a handful to run forward with, and it becomes 50% of their job to push that innovation forward. What I like about that is not necessarily about the specific projects that come out of it, which I think are great, but also it triggers that entrepreneurial mindset, right? It triggers employees to be thinking about what can be improved, what can be capitalized on, what can we do better, and sort of incentivize those employees to get that growth mindset and gives them an outlet for it. So
Yes, a continuous learning mindset and the ability to actually learn on the job is something that is definitely important for many people. And I think very often even a decision maker for them of where they actually want to work. Tell me a little bit about the decision-making process. So companies that want to make sure they're on the right track in this era of digital disruption, they have to invest in people. Yes, it's something that we talked about. They have to restructure the processes and also invest in new software solutions. You mentioned particularly cloud solutions, but is there something else and specifically that you think companies should definitely invest in?
yeah, I think it's about it's going to differ by company, by strategic objectives, by yada yada yada. So I was interviewing one spirits company, European spirits company, that operated in several different markets. And they were saying, a unified CRM doesn't make a lot of sense for us because our customers are so different based on the markets that we're in. But back end ERP system where we can manage our suppliers, where we can manage our employees, whether we manage sort of the back end really does make a lot of sense. So there it would make sense, okay, that's the system you want to emphasize. Whereas other companies, consulting company that I interviewed, their skills were their needs were very different, and maybe they go to the cloud because cybersecurity was a major concern of theirs, and we think about and cloud tends to have much stronger, because these are the world's best companies offering it, tend to offer more secure solutions than homegrown ones, and so that one is really going to depend. You need to sit down. The executives need to sit down and just say where these types of innovations make sense. And the key is, when you're talking about ERP systems, obviously you can't start small. You've got to sort of do it. But in other places, it's more about experimenting with systems. So in one business unit, in one team, try doing something in a slightly different way, and then see what works. And when it works, then you begin to roll it out across other locations and across the whole enterprise. But I really advocate a test and learn approach, whereas you try some small experiments, see what works, keep what works, and iterate on it, and then those that don't, kill fairly easily and fairly quickly. And I think there's opportunities to do that in project teams in ways that you wouldn't have the opportunity to do if you're doing enterprise-wide rollouts. So I think not just thinking big, but also thinking small, and figure out how to test and learn with what's going to work in certain areas, certain regions, with certain teams, and then take those successes and use that to drive change across the organization. I found that most organizations are willing to experiment. Many are not willing to sort of take the results of that experiment and drive real change in the organization. And that's what separates what we call the digitally maturing companies in our first book, the ones that are getting it right, from the early stage companies, those that are behind the ball. Everybody experiments. Are you using those experiments to drive change?
Can you elaborate a little bit more on this digital maturity model that you have? I think many companies are a little bit lost in this whole endeavor of digital transformation, and maybe they know, yes, okay, we have to go to the cloud, yes, we can test out things, but they don't really have a clear idea of, okay, where am I standing actually on this journey? How far am I right now, or how far am I behind maybe? So as you said, you have a model for this, right? How does it work?
Well, it's a fairly crude metric. So what we ask employees to do, and our survey respondents to do, is imagine an organization that's perfectly digitally transformed, and does basically everything. There's language in the book about it, but basically is as digital as you can get. If that is the How close does your organization come to that ideal on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being the ideal perfect organization and 1 being as far away from that ideal as we can imagine? And there are all sorts of limitations to this measure. Some of it is, are employee perceptions accurate? Some of it is, are all parts of the organization, are you going to evaluate all the organization in the same way? Are different departments further along than others? So limitations, acknowledging those limitations, we then put grouped companies. If they rated a 1 to a 3, we called those early stage companies. A 4 to a 6, and we found those to be called those maturing companies or developing companies. And then 7 or above are maturing companies. And we really are sort of encouraging organizations to move closer to that ideal. Now, what's really interesting is, despite being on a 1 to 10 scale, the organizations that were largely the strongest were those that rated themselves a 7 or an 8, that said, we are close to this ideal, but we really still have work to do. Because that's probably the best. If you think you've made it as a company and you're as digitally transformed as you can be, you don't get it. You don't recognize that this is, and this is what we call the transformation myth, right? That transformation is a one and done sort of thing, whereas instead transforming, ongoing, as these digital disruption is going to happen for the next 50 years. Climate change is going to keep happening and require us to respond. New acute disruptions are going to come on the horizon that we have to deal with. And it's just about this constant sort of constant transformation of our organization, realigning it towards the changing reality and the changing competitive environment is really where those digitally maturing companies come from. And in fact, we had a really great interview with the CIO of CarMax, or I think he's the chief information and technology officer. We interviewed him in 2016 the first time as part of this research. And he said, I said, what are you doing to transform your organization? And he said, I don't know what the world is going to look like 4 to 5 years from now. All I know is it's going to be characterized by rapid change, and I need to build an organization to be able to adapt to that change. So I think that's the key for digital transformation is we don't always know what the world is going to look like 5 years from now, but we do know this change is going to keep coming. So how do you build your organization to be able to respond to this change as productively as possible? And I think that's the goal of digital transformation.
It always has something philosophical to it, right, in a way, so that you have to understand how much there is actually going forward still. You have to understand the unknown, you have to understand what there is in order to see yourself, how far you're still behind. And if you think you had just made it right now, then it's just, it's impossible to actually be there. So if you think you are there, then you are most probably not, right? So.
Absolutely. And the nice thing about this digital maturity spectrum is it was fairly normally distributed. About 50% put themselves in the middle, say we're somewhere 4 to 6. About 25% said we're in the early stages, 1 to 3, and about 25% said we're developing. And we saw that shift to the right over the course of our research. So there is a sense that the companies are making progress. But I do think everybody still has room to grow.
Let's talk about the future. So you clearly stated that between the first and the second book there was some change. Let's say that also changed the trajectory of the second book in general. Now going forward, have you seen changes already since the last book? Or, what is your next project?
Yeah, so we were able to, we were fortunate enough so our book was due actually in October of 2020. So we thought we were coming to the end of the pandemic at that point. Vaccines were announced. It looks like things were going to work out. And then we asked for permission to write the epilogue late, like December or January. And we said, it looks like we know the trajectory of the pandemic at this point. But if we're wrong, it almost doesn't matter because the lesson is still stays the same. You still have this three-stage response. You still need to innovate. You still need to adapt to change. And so in some ways, Omicron was, from the book to now, it didn't end when we thought. And now we think it's going to come to an end, but something else can happen, and it doesn't change the business case. I'm fairly firm in my belief that we are going to see rapid innovation and experimentation and competitive. We're going to see the most competitive environment globally coming up in the next 3 to 5 years. And partially we're still seeking to understand, like we've already had a ringside seat for this transformation and the disruption going on. We'd be silly to abandon it now. So I think we will continue to follow that, but it's also, sort of, what is the CEO's role in this? How do you lead in these efforts? And then, what is going to be the fundamental structural changes in the business environment as a result of this? I think it's still too soon to know, and I'm interested in following along to see how it evolves.
Okay. So to summarize the conversation and the whole topic around digital transformation, disruption, and how companies have to adapt to this change, is there one advice that sticks out the most for you, one topic where you would say, okay, if you just remember one thing, then please remember this one thing. This is really the most important aspect not to forget going forward.
How about two things?
Okay.
One is this emphasis that disruption is happening. So I hope I've convinced you that disruption, like COVID, is not over. I mean, even if the COVID pandemic ends, the business disruption will continue. And so trying to convince you that the real disruption of the pandemic still lies in our future as we grapple with the aftermath and try to sort of rebuild companies and societies in ways in response to all this. The second thing is this growth mindset that you can innovate, you can do this. If you put in the work, you can build better organizations. And part of it is you may not have the perfect vision of that right now, but getting started is the important part. Getting started, having those conversations of who do we want to be. Getting started and having those conversations, or what kind of digital innovations can we do. Getting started with those conversations of what skill sets do we lack and what do we need to find either in-house or beyond to sort of equip our organization to build, to compete in this future. So in summary, it's this disruptive future is coming, and your organization can adapt to it if you start now sort of doing those plans to sort of say, this is the organization we want to become in this future.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot for these insights and sharing your knowledge on the topic. Thank you very much for having you on the show.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me, and I hope we can talk again in the future.
And thank you for listening to our podcast. Hope this episode had helped you better understand how your company can adapt in this era of continuous disruption. If you like this episode, please share it with your friends and colleagues. We have some interesting speakers coming up in our next episode, so follow Amplifyre on LinkedIn for more updates.